response to transgenderism. Most of it you're going to see is the secular part. The last part will be the Christian part. And the reason for that is there's a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions here that, just from a non-Christian point of view, that need to be processed and analyzed. And your response should be based on that, right? So just some background. I did this last week, I'm doing it this week. This is a very serious conversation for mature adults. If you can be respectful and act like a mature adult, then please stay. Disagreement is not hatred, and speech is not verbal abuse or violence. Can't believe I have to say that, but I have to say that. If you're going to be disrespectful, then please leave now. This is your chance. Okay. So I am going to give you this as sort of a refresher. We talked about how Francis Schaeffer saw society fracturing people into two parts. He called it the lower story, which is the body, the facts, the things that you can measure, touch, or feel. And he talked about the upper story, which was inside the mind. We say personhood in this case, or gender. It's private, subjective, internal. And what we saw, we talked about last week, was that gender and queer theory separated the two, and that there was this unbridgeable gap, and there was a total separation between the two, and that the body no longer informed the mind, and the mind was disconnected from the body. And if that's a refresher for those who were here, for those who weren't here, watch the video. So we're going to jump into this gender dysphoria and social contagion. So on some of these slides, to protect my voice, we're going to go from front to back, my right to left. If you can say your name and read the slide, just so I can save my voice, that would be good. But let's start with this one. What is gender identity?
What is gender identity? Gender identity refers to a person's deeply felt, internal, and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's physiology or designated sex at birth.
And one of the things we talked about last week was we weren't actually sure there was such a thing as gender identity. Because we'll talk about that in a minute. But the words here are kind of strange. Because they say deeply felt internal and individual experience. That sounds like their feelings to me. What about you? And the person's physiology sounds like their body. And designated sex at birth is kind of a very strange phrase. Because sex is something your body has, so can you change your sex? Right? Why not just say, or sex, as opposed to designated sex at birth? So there's some strange wordplay going on here. So, question to everybody, why isn't plain language being used? What do you think? Why do you think they're not saying plain terms? Just speak it out.
I mean, this is kind of assuming the worst, but one reason could be to confuse you so that you can't provide a good argument against it.
Yeah? Anybody else?
Keeps the door open. There's no limiting factors really. It could be anything you want it to be.
So there's nothing objective about it, or?
Not if it's an individual feeling. No.
That's what you feel. So I hand over there.
Feeling would seem to me like the connotation is something not objective, but deeply felt. That's something you don't want to hurt. Whether the connotations are different for deeply felt versus feeling.
Yeah. Yes.
Governments love vague wording because it gives them gray area to work with.
Yeah. So I think you're getting the gist of it, right? I'm trying to point out that there's purpose behind this wording. You have to figure out what you think the purpose is, right? You're pretty close. Next, please. Sorry.
No worries. Gender dysphoria. The term transgender refers to a person whose sex assigned at birth, i.e. the sex assigned by a physician at birth, usually based on the external genitalia, does not match their gender identity, one's physiological sense of their gender. Some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria, which refers to the psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Though gender dysphoria often begins in childhood, some people may not experience until after puberty or much later. The 1994 edition of the U.S. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders referred to cross-gender identification as gender identity disorder. Changed to gender dysphoria in 2013 edition, which emphasizes the mental anguish from the disorder.
Right. So, a question. I have a question for you. If this is supposed to define gender dysphoria, why do they talk about transgender? Question. Told you it's interactive.
To try to distinguish the two.
Try to distinguish the two. Yeah.
The wording says that some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria. That kind of indicates that, at least in their wording, not all transgender people have gender dysphoria.
That's correct. But they're trying to link the two, right? The purpose of putting them in the same definition is to link the two. Why would they want to link the two? Think about that. Think about that. Now, just a comment here is that it used to be called gender identity disorder. And when they phrased it that way, it was that your identity was a mismatch, right? Your gender identity. Now they talk about it gender dysphoria. So the problem is not the identity, it's the dysphoria, right? There's a change in emphasis. Not a change in the actual disorder, but a change in emphasis. Okay. So gender dysphoria is a mental disorder. I don't want to stigmatize that. I don't want to overemphasize that, because there's lots of mental disorders. There's bulimia, there's autism, ADHD is called a disorder, right? And the reason I say that is we don't want to stigmatize the person who suffers from it. It is a real condition, it is not a fake condition, but it is a mental disorder. How should we respond to gender dysphoria?
Elizabeth, queer and gender theory could be a lie and false, but there can still be people who suffer from gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a confusion that results in deep unhappiness. Those who suffer from it are not necessarily trying to promote transgender activism. We should treat everyone with kindness, compassion, and respect. All people who suffer from a mental disorder need this. However, real kindness means believing and telling the truth. True compassion is grounded in reality, nature's purpose for humanity.
Right. So, trying to suggest to you that these people need compassion. Right? So there are other conditions that are similar. There are people who feel like their arms or legs are not part of their body, and they want to cut them off. Right? There are very strange things that go on in the mind. These people have a deep unhappiness, and they should command our empathy and compassion. So that's how I think we should respond to the individual, right, who has this. Yes?
Have they linked it with people who have previously had sexual trauma?
We'll talk about that. Good question. Now there's a term we need to define, intersex. What do you think intersex is?
Someone that has both.
Speak up.
Oh, sorry. Someone that has both male and female genitalia.
Close. Close. Remember back, I think, here? Yes.
My name is Bailey. Intersexuality, the condition such as that occurring in congenital adrenal hyperplasia or androgen insensitivity syndrome, of either having both male and female gonadal tissue in one individual, or of having the gonads of one sex and external genitalia that is of the other sex or is ambiguous. Intersex is a physical condition where chromosomes, genitals, or gonads development do not allow a baby to be distinctively identified as male or female at birth. This is a biological condition, and the child's chromosomes should identify them as male or female, and the great majority of them do not identify as transgender, but rather as male or female.
Right.
Male and female, I'm sorry.
So you read that very well, though, right? Yeah. So these are babies that when they're born, you can't actually determine what sex they are because their sex organs are not able to make that decision. Right? They grow up and they normally figure this out. Their chromosomes, there's no such thing as a person who's half woman, half man. Their chromosomes are either male or female, so they are biologically one of the sexes. The reason I bring this up is that this is used in some cases as evidence that there is such a thing as a gender identity, and that you can be the opposite of what your gender identity can be the opposite of what your biological sex is. What might be wrong with that thought? Think of upper story, lower story. Yes.
Gender identity is more based on like, I guess, mindset, whereas this is more biological, as you said. Based
Correct. Right. All right. So the lower story is the body. This is a body thing. Sex. Gender is an upper story, a mind thing. So this has nothing to do in terms of evidence for gender identity. It's a physical condition. Yes.
Don't you have some biological places where you have XXY chromosomes?
Yes, but those wind up being either male or female. Like there's an XO and and it's not. Yeah.
Did you have like the extra chromosome that will?
You have the extra chromosome, but the reading I've done is that they wind up. Even though they may have an extra chromosome, you wind up being one or the other. Right? Like an XXY is really a woman. Okay. Next, please.
I'm Mallory. What is transgender? Transgender. Of, relating to, or being a person whose gender identity differs from the sex the person had or was identified as having at birth. Especially of, relating to, or being a person whose gender identity is opposite the sex the person had or is identified as having at birth.
Okay. So, gender dysphoria is you believe you're in the wrong body. Does this mention gender dysphoria? Is this a smaller set of people or a bigger set of people than gender dysphoria?
Right. Bigger.
So is it more strictly defining than gender dysphoria or more broad? Speak up, please. It's
More
not broad. Okay. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. Okay. So this is my analysis, and that transgender is an umbrella term covering several mental health problems that used to be distinct. There used to be things called cross-dressers, transvestites, and transsexuals. There's also new categories of gender which seem to add to the confusion. You have genderqueer, you have bigender, you have pangender, gender fluid, and many more. I would suggest that this is to inflate the population to have more political power. That's why this term has expanded. Right? You can disagree with me, and that's fine. So what is a transvestite? Anybody know?
Isn't it like
Just go ahead and speak
someone
up.
that
Don't hold your hand.
cross-dresses?
Pardon?
Someone that like cross-dresses.
Someone that dresses like the other sex. Yes. Please, next.
Lydia, transvestite. Psychiatry. A
Yep.
person, especially someone assigned male at birth, who assumes the dress and manner usually associated with a different sex for psychological or sexual gratification.
Okay. Haven't heard that in the news lately, have you? That word has actually disappeared. It's being replaced by what word? Speak up. Transgender, yes. Question. What distinguishes a gender dysphoric person who isn't medically treated from a transvestite? If I have gender dysphoria and I dress like the other sex, but I'm not being treated with hormones or anything like that, am I different than a transvestite?
It seems that the transvestite category does not say that the person thinks that they are the opposite sex, they just happen to cross-dress. Whereas gender dysphoria seems to say that you think you are the opposite sex.
Correct. That's a good answer. But if I was a transvestite and I wanted to gain some special privileges, how would you distinguish me from a transvestite, somebody who had gender dysphoria?
Because it's based on feelings, you really can't.
Correct. Correct. You cannot. And so when you see somebody who says they're transgender, you can ask yourself, is that gender dysphoria, or are they just like to cross-dress and they're really transvestite? There is a, so if we were to talk about gender dysphoria, a lot of times it will start early in childhood. In fact, one of the articles talks about that and has an instance of that. Where we leave off?
My name is Aiden. Child onset gender dysphoria. Some children exhibit gender non-conforming behavior from an early age. Clothing, play style, playmates, interests, etc. A boy may be called a sissy and a girl may be called a tomboy. Children with autistic traits experience gender nonconformity. Gender dysphoric children assert that they are the other sex. When gender nonconforming children are not encouraged to identify as the opposite sex, the great majority, between 60% to 90%, adjust to their birth sex after puberty. They may exhibit same-sex attraction. Social transition means adopting the name, pronouns, clothes of the opposite sex, and allowing the child to use the toilet and facilities of the other sex. If social transition is permitted, the dysphoria will certainly persist. If the social transition is not permitted, most children desist once puberty has occurred. A Tavistock Child Identity Clinic study found a patient taking puberty blockers did not desist from dysphoria. 90.3% of children who did not take them did later desist from dysphoria. Publication of this study was blocked but has been released.
So this is a very important slide to understand the treatment you might want to go down. So at the top, it talks about how children in early age may exhibit behavior that one would attribute, if one talked about stereotypes, to the other sex, right? Boys who play with dolls, girls who play cowboys, girls who climb trees, boys who comb their hair or get it made up. I don't know. So you have this gender non-conforming behavior based on stereotypes. Now, when gender non-conforming children are not encouraged to identify as the opposite sex, the majority adjust to their birth sex after puberty. Okay, if I were to ask you this question, if you were to look at somebody who is a boy who's 6 years old and a girl who's 6 years old, do they look very different? Not really, no, they don't. Now, if you look at a boy who's 18 years old and a girl who's 18 years old, do they look different? Yeah, they do. What's the difference? Puberty, right? So puberty has a way of sort of knocking people out of this. So that's important. Now, there's something called social transition here we talk about, which is when the boy says he's a girl, the girl says he's a boy, says she's a boy, and you let them play that out in their life. right? In that case, if you allow them to do the social transitioning, to play act the other sex, the gender dysphoria persists, right? If you do not let them play it out, then you're up at that 60% to 90% that correct after puberty. If you were to let them persist, to play act, and then you let them have puberty blockers, you have condemned them to a path, right? You understand that? 90% probability they will continue down that path. Whereas if you did not do that, if you did not let them play act the other sex, if you did not give them puberty blockers, 60 to 90% of them would correct. Do you understand that? That's important for coming up. So, just to reiterate, just to emphasize, 60 to 90% of gender nonconforming children grow out of it after puberty, but a child who socially transitions and uses puberty blockers will persist with that gender dysphoria. Okay. Hey, psychology. Maybe people take psychology here. Really? Okay, well then, let's go through. Next, please. Yes?
Jethro. What is a social contagion? APA Dictionary of Psychology. Social contagion. The spread of behaviors, attitudes, and effect through crowds and other types of social aggregates from one member to another. Early analyses of social contagion suggested that it resulted from the heightened suggestibility of members and likened the process to the spread of contagious diseases. Subsequent studies suggest the social contagion is sustained by relatively mundane interpersonal processes, such as imitation, conformity, universality, and mimicry, also called group contagion. See also behavioral contagion, emotional contagion, mass contagion.
I had to look this up because of the next slide. But if someone were to summarize this, how would you summarize it simply?
Monkey see, monkey do.
Monkey see, monkey do. Okay, correct. So what it is? Okay, that's simple. So I can't get as simple as that. And this is the reason I wanted to bring that up. I think, Poon, if you can read this slide, that would be great.
Yeah. My name is Poon. Rapid onset gender dysphoria. First major study in 2018 by Dr. Lisa Lippman. Adolescents experiencing ROGD tend to belong to a group of friends and female. Multiple group members became transgender identified account at the same time, all immersed in the same social media. Individuals may suffer from multiple issues: self-hatred, shame, anxiety, self-disgust, low self-esteem, depression, negative mood, eating disorders, negative body image, and self-harming behaviors, cutting. It is a social contagion. A peer group fosters the mutual belief that anxiety and unhappiness may be due to being transgender. Gender transition provides the solution. Native confidence that transition leads to acceptance by peers. Social media cheers on transition.
So there's contagion is when, so it's sort of a psychological disease is contagious. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is the theory, which seems to be backed up by data, that we're now seeing clusters of female friends in their teens all deciding they're transgender at the same time. That is a contagion. It's a social contagion. And you can imagine how that happens, right? So they're going through puberty themselves. They don't like their bodies. Their bodies are changing underneath them. There may be other things they think, psychologically. One of them decides that they're transgender. And this is what I found out that I did not know, being a male, is that females bond in a way that they want to empathize with their friends who are going through problems. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I read. And that would mean that there's a form of empathy going on where one person in the group feels bad and the other wants to feel bad along with them. And if you look at society, the way we treat this, right? gender transition is said to be a solution to the problem, they're encouraged because they're cheered on by it, and this is happening. Let's talk about it. Next, please. Yes.
Is there a social contagion? Transgenderism is primarily driven by social contagion among younger generations, and especially among teenage girls. In the UK alone, for instance, there was a 4,400% increase over the last decade for girls seeking medical transition. In the US, a June 2022 report from the CDC found that while the 13 to 17 age group comprises only 7.6% of the population, it comprises 18.3% of all transgender identified Americans. A remarkable 1.4% of this age group identifies as transgender, compared with 0.5% of all adults. In the near future, the number of detransitioners will grow as more young adults who were caught in social contagion begin to regret their immature decisions, co-signed and affirmed by the psychomedico-therapeutic complex, and court-ordered revelations will make clear what evils the transgender movement has wrought.
This guy obviously doesn't have a very positive concept. And I think it isn't transgenderism, it should be called gender dysphoria. Right? Misuse of the term. Key takeaways, in the last 10 years, there's a 44 times multiple of primarily girls who decided they're transgender. 44 times. That's a huge number. Men, this is one where you may get squeamish. I think, Joe, you're next. Oh, sorry.
A detransitioner from Massachusetts who goes by the name Shapeshifter 32 told the YouTuber Blair White, a transgender identified man, that he had received surgery in his 20s to have his penis removed and replaced by a neo-vagina, which his body perceives as a wound and tries to close up intermittently. He said, "I will never be able to get my penis back, which is extremely traumatic for me. I want it back and I can't. Sex is traumatic for me now because I've had botched surgeries. His adult consent to medical transition means nothing. Any sane society must acknowledge that butchering the human person is categorically wrong."
A couple of things. He had his male sex organ cut off and replaced by a neo-vagina. This is unnatural. How do you know it's unnatural? Because his body perceives it as a wound and it tries to heal. Imagine living with that. Right? And he wants to go back, and can he?
No.
No. Was he an adult when he consented? Yes. This is tragedy? Tragic? So you wonder what causes gender dysphoria. There's no really clear answer, a single cause. There's all sorts of speculations. One is, and this is actually what some have said, they didn't like being a cis, white girl. They wanted a victim status. And so they thought transgender was the right way to go about it, literally. Word for word, okay? That's part of the reason, social status. Some speculate the girls may be exposed to violent porn. They say, I don't want to be abused, I want to be the abuser if that's going to happen, right? Emotional abuse, physical abuse, brainwashing on social media, that's what comes up to. Misdiagnosis. That picture is actually from a medical journal. I'm not going to read it. There is two theories I'll briefly touch on. What if gender dysphoria is caused by genetics, right? That's sort of the go-to thought in society. Please.
Mariana, what if gender dysphoria is caused by genetics? Traits that are genetically based may not be good for us. It doesn't matter whether we're born this way. There are plenty of genetically influenced traits and diseases that are nevertheless undesirable. A predisposition to depression, alcoholism, drug addiction, and heart disease may be genetic. But we are morally responsible for how we respond to our genetic heritage. Genetics does not tell us whether a behavior is right or wrong. Genes are not fixed. Life events can trigger biochemical messages that turn them on or off. This means a trait is not fixed or unchangeable. There is no evidence for this.
Right. Aside from that, you're still responsible for what you do with your genetic heritage. Genetics are not deterministic. So you're morally inclined to choose what to do. The third is that genes are not necessarily fixed. We've learned that genes actually respond to the environment around us being turned on or off. And really, there's no evidence that it's genetics anyway. That's the bottom line. No evidence. There's another theory. What if I have the wrong brain for the body's sex? So it's sort of a derivative, but a little bit different. Where do we leave off? Please. Yeah.
Eliana, what if it is the wrong brain for the body's sex? Brain sex theory. Transgender people have a male-type brain in a female body or vice versa. Psychological environment in childhood can change the brain. Brain differences are influenced by experience. The brain changes in response to experience and is not fixed. Brain can be rewired by trauma. Trauma therapy can change the brain's response. All studies are after the effect of transition, so the brain may be rewired by the transition. The effect of transition and not the cause. There is no evidence for this being the cause.
Right. So the idea is you have the wrong brain, or the brain of the opposite sex in your body. There's something called neuroplasticity, where your brain actually changes in response to your environment and your behaviors. That's how you can multiply. That's how you can memorize multiplication tables, right? At first, it's really hard. Or when you're driving, when you start driving, you have to think about when to apply the gas or the brake, right? But after you've done it for a couple of years, you just don't even think about it. It just happens. Because your brain is changing. So brains can be influenced by your experience. So if they were to ever show that the brains of a gender dysphoric person were different than a non-gender dysphoric person, and that person lived as the other sex, it may be that them living as the other sex is what actually changed the brain. Does that make sense? So their living as the opposite sex was the cause of their brain change. Their brain change wasn't the cause of them living as the opposite sex. And there's no evidence for this either. Any questions at this point? Yes?
So I'm just curious about your thoughts on whether being transgender is wrong or sinful.
So when you say transgender, do you mean gender dysphoric? Because transgender is a whole bunch of behaviors.
I'm not talking about, I don't know, there were just some things that we said on the slide that were like, you're morally responsible for your actions in response to like whether you have gender dysphoria. So I'm just curious about like your thoughts. I know different people have different opinions on whether it's sinful to medically transition. So I mean, everyone else, like I'm also curious about those thoughts. I know. That's a different topic.
So the confusion and the mental anguish that would be associated with this is something I can't relate to. So I don't feel like I'm competent to say that, because if I had to accommodate this to lessen that pain, to make it through life, I might do that. At the same time, I was talking with somebody today, another Ratio Christi director, who had a student who said when they looked in the mirror, they're a man, they saw a woman. Well, that person is now married with a child and says, even though I see myself that way, I am not that way. I am made a male. I will act like a male. I will be a male. So there's all sorts of unknowns here, and I don't think we know enough. Except what I'll tell you is what we're doing is the absolute wrong thing in terms of secular society. By the way, I'll be here afterwards to talk to you if you have questions too. If you don't like any of my answers, please tell me. Let's talk about transgender activism and response. How many of you are gender affirming care? What does it sound like? What does gender affirming care sound like?
If you claim that you're a certain gender colleges is expected to just affirm that.
Correct. Next, please.
Gender affirming care, what it is? Yes. What is gender affirming care? Gender affirming care is a supportive form of healthcare. It consists of an array of services that may include medical, surgical, mental health, and non-medical services for transgender and non-binary people. For transgender and non-binary children and adolescents, early gender affirming care is crucial to overall health and well-being, as it allows the child or adolescent to focus on social transitions and can increase their confidence while navigating the healthcare system.
It sounds really nice, except that if you remember back, social transition prevents them from going out of gender dysphoria puberty. This is the wrong treatment. So what is the procedure? Way back over here, Pablo, I think.
The procedure is laser hair removal, puberty blockers, masculinizing hormone replacement therapy, feminizing hormone therapy, voice and communication therapy, mental health care, reproductive counseling, surgical treatments, facial reconstruction surgery, chest and breast surgery, and gender affirming surgery.
Yeah, there's a bunch of other things in round brackets there. So this is being promoted to young children. Teenagers. This could be your brother or sister, niece, nephew, cousin. This is what gender affirming care results in. Let's look at it a little bit more. Let's dig in. Where are we?
I'm Emma. Gender affirming care, what is the procedure? On the morning of your surgery, you will meet with your surgeon and an anesthesiologist. They will give you an overview of how the day is going to play out. They will probably give you an anti-anxiety medication or another sedative to help you relax. And they will bring you to the operating room. The long-term success of your vaginoplasty will depend largely on how well you follow the post-operative instructions. Your surgeon will give you a vaginal dilator to begin using as soon as your bandages are removed. This dilation device must be used daily for at least 1 year to maintain the desired vaginal depth and girth. Your surgeon will provide you with a dilation schedule. Typically, it involves inserting the dilator for 10 minutes, 3 times per day for the first 3 months, and once per day for the next 3 months. Then you'll do it 2 to 3 times per week for at least 1 year. The diameter of the dilator will also increase as the months go by.
What do you think of that procedure?
Disgusting.
I think that's a good word for it.
It's torture.
Gender affirming care. The diagnosis problem. This is from a paper called Disorders of Gender Identities, written in 2018. I would suggest to you that most research written after 2018 is suspect. And we'll talk about why later. But next, please.
Diagnosis. The least certain diagnosis is that made by the patient, made as it is without any training or objectivity. This uncertainty is not lessened by the patient's frequently high degree of conviction. Neither does the support of others with gender dysphoria help, since the conviction leads people to associate with the like-minded to discount or fail to seek out mispromoted views.
So self-diagnosis of gender dysphoria is not objective, but gender affirming care acts as if it is. This is a great article. It was one of the ones I suggested you read. We're going to dig into this in several bits and pieces. Please.
Kennedy, gender affirming care, the interventions. Gender affirming care covers a spectrum of interventions. It can entail adopting a child's preferred name and pronouns and letting them dress in alignment with their gender identity, called social transitioning. It can incorporate therapy or other forms of psychological treatment, and from around the start of adolescence, it can include medical interventions such as puberty blockers, hormones, and in some cases surgery. In all of it, the aim is to support and affirm the child's gender identity. But families that go the medical route venture onto uncertain grounds where science has yet to catch up with the practice. While the number of gender clinics treating children in the United States has grown from 0 to more than 100 in the past 15 years, and waiting lists are long. Strong evidence of the efficacy and possible long-term consequences of that treatment remains scant.
So this is actually a pretty balanced article. Let's see. So gender affirming care, the same as the support and affirm the child's gender identity. But if you remember, supporting the child's gender identity means that they will not have that 60 to 90% opportunity to alter. Notice the number of gender identity clinics has gone from 0 to 100 in the past 15 years. Right? That's a big number. And they say that strong evidence of the efficacy remains scant, which really means there's not a lot of evidence that really helps. Next, please.
My name is Ben. Puberty blockers and sex hormones do not have U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA) approval for children's gender care. No clinical trials have established their safety for such off-label use. The drug's long-term effects on fertility and sexual function remain unclear. And in 2016, the FDA ordered makers of puberty blockers to add a warning about the psychiatric problems to the drug's label after the agency received several reports of suicidal thoughts in children who were taking them.
So, summary. No studies have shown that puberty blockers are safe in the short and long term. In fact, there's a warning that you may be suicidal if you take puberty blockers, right? Remember that. Remember that. We'll see something surprising later. Next, please.
Complications from genital surgeries are common. A California study found that a quarter of 869
vaginoplasty
patients with a mean age of 39 had a surgical complication so severe that they had to be hospitalized again. Among those patients, 44% needed additional surgery to address the complications, which included bleeding and bowel injuries.
So that's where they cut off the male organ, they create the wound in your body, and they stitch it up so that it's a pseudo-neovagina. 25% of these patients had really bad, severe surgical complications. Sound safe? Would you have an operation if you knew that you had a 25% chance of having to go back in the hospital and have another surgery? Next, please.
Davis. More broadly, no large-scale studies have tracked people who receive gender-related medical care as children to determine how many remain satisfied with their treatment as they age, and how many eventually regretted transitioning. The same lack of clarity holds true for the contentious issue of detransition, when a patient stops or reverses the transition process.
Still are saying we don't know how effective it is. Okay. Title, scientific paper, recent, very recent. The myth of reliable research in pediatric gender medicine, a critical evaluation of the Dutch studies and research that has followed. Gender affirming care was based on 2 Dutch studies that happened a while back. Okay? It is now being stopped in several European countries. You can just read the first portion, whoever's, are we back up here? Okay.
Brian. 2 Dutch studies formed the foundation and the best available evidence for the practice of youth medical gender transition. We demonstrate that this work is methodologically flawed and should have never been used in medical settings as justification to scale this innovative clinical practice.
That's good. That's good. I think that's a good summary. You get it? The 2 studies that were used as the basis for gender affirming care had methodological flaws and should never have been used in medical settings as justification to scale this. And this is scientific sarcasm, okay? To scale this innovative clinical practice. You can look it up and you can read it if you want. So there is no basis. In fact, the basis has been proven wrong. Study, transgenders have 4.5 times higher rate of psychiatric illnesses than normal people. So that means that there are other factors that are confounding this, right? I have to skip this for the sake of time. Suicide risk. This is the thing that doctors will say to the parents, would you like a live daughter or a dead son? Because your son's going to commit suicide. That's pretty intimidating, isn't it? We're going to go through a couple of slides now that talks about that. I think we're back up here, Austin.
Sure. Gender affirming care, suicide risk. Some gender care professionals complain that suicide risk is too often used to pressure and even frighten parents into consenting to treatment. I think it's irresponsible for clinicians to do that, said Anderson, the former president of WPATH's U.S. chapter. As a clinical psychologist, I don't do a suicide assessment by membership in a class. The level of risk varies tremendously across individuals. De Vries, the Dutch researcher, told Reuters there is no evidence that providing care immediately leads to a decline in self-harm or would prevent suicide.
So there's no evidence that providing care immediately, gender-affirming care immediately, leads to a decline in self-harm or prevent suicide. I'm going to have to skip this next slide for the sake of time. Here's, if you remember, they had to put the warning on hormones, or was it puberty blockers, that this could lead to suicide. Here is a study. Now, it's not what I would call a standard scientific study, but the analysis is pretty good. I think it stands up. Called Puberty Blockers, Cross-Sex Hormones, and Youth Suicide. Please.
In the past several years, the suicide rate among those ages 12 to 23 has become significantly higher in states that have a provision that allows minors to receive routine health care without parental consent than in states without such a provision. Before 2010, these two groups of states did not differ in their youth suicide rates. Starting in 2010, when puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones became widely available, elevated suicide rates in states where minors can more easily access those medical interventions became observable.
Yes, please.
Rather than being protective against suicide, this pattern indicates that easier access by minors to cross-sex medical interventions without parental consent is associated with higher risk of suicide. The Heritage model plotted the difference in a 3-year rolling average of suicide rates between states with minor access provisions and states with no such provisions. Chart 2 plots the trend in this difference for those 12 to 23.
It's okay. There's just a lot more detail. Remember that puberty blockers have a warning they could lead to increased suicide. There's two groups of states. One group of states require parental consent to get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. The other group of states do not require parental consent to get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. The trend is now, up to 2010, the trend was that these had the same similar suicide rates, but now the trend is when you can get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones without parental consent, the suicide rates are rising. So this would suggest that instead of preventing suicide, it is actually increasing the suicide rate. Yet to be confirmed in a strong scientific study, but it's plausible. So the suicide risk of gender-affirming care, the statement that gender-affirming care reduces suicide risk may be totally false and may actually increase suicide risk. And does it actually prevent suicide? Transgender flight attendant, Kayla Scott, who gained fame after appearing in a United Airlines commercial. That's very gender affirming, don't you think? You're on commercials across the U.S. Was found dead Monday in her Colorado home. She was 25. She committed suicide. I don't think gender affirming care prevents suicide. This is an article that, again, this is one of those must-reads. We're going to go through this really quick because we're running out of time. Who's next?
think I
Over here.
Okay. I am a 42-year-old St. Louis native, a queer woman, and politically to the left of Bernie Sanders. My worldview has deeply shaped my career. I've spent my professional life providing counseling to the vulnerable populations, children in foster care, sexual minorities, the poor. For almost 4 years, I worked at the Washington University School of Medicine Division of Infectious Diseases with teens and young adults who were HIV positive. Many of them were trans or otherwise gender non-conforming, and I could relate. Through childhood and adolescence, I did a lot of gender questioning myself. I'm now married to a trans man, and together we are raising my 2 biological children from a previous marriage and 3 foster children we hope to adopt.
So what she's doing is introducing herself. She is not a right-wing, militia person. This is somebody who is a woman, a queer woman, married to a trans man. So very, very inclined towards supporting gender dysphoria. So this is not somebody who's a natural, naturally antagonistic to this. Next, please.
Today, I am speaking out. I am doing so knowing how toxic the public conversation is around this highly contentious issue and the ways that my testimony might be misused. I am doing so knowing that I am putting myself at serious personal and professional risk. Almost everyone in my life advised me to keep my head down, but I cannot in good conscience do so, because of what is happening to the scores of children is far more important to my comfort, and what is happening to them is morally and medically appalling.
So she's explaining herself.
A report last year on a British pediatric transgender center found that about 1/3 of the patients referred there were on the autism spectrum. The doctors privately recognized these false self-diagnoses as a manifestation of social contagion. They even acknowledge that suicide has an element of social contagion. But when I said the cluster of girls streaming into our service looked as if their gender issues might be a manifestation of social contagion, the doctor said gender identity reflected something innate.
So the first part talks about many of these girls who came in who thought they had gender dysphoria had a bunch of other mental illnesses, comorbidities, that compounded the diagnosis. And it may be that those are the things that were actually causing them to feel gender dysphoria. So I think gender affirming care is unethical. There are no long-term studies about chemically castrating boys or cutting off perfectly good organs of girls that this improves their lives. These radical improving, quote, treatments have only started in the last several years. People live for decades, and any study needs to extend this into adulthood. There are many testimonies of many named children wanting to do transition back to original sex. Doctors, we're supposed to take the Hippocratic oath of do no harm. I don't think this meets that standard. Therefore, I think it's unethical. So what could be an ethical response? I'm going to quickly look at 3 examples. Anorexia, what I call sheepia, and transgender. Anorexia. How many of you know what anorexia nervosa is? Okay, so you don't need to go through that. We'll take 2 minutes. Can this row do the first? Actually, these 2 rows do the first question. These 2 rows do the second question. These 2 rows do the third question. 2 minutes.
Okay. Was it as simple to let the videos by themselves?
I mean, obviously not.
I don't hear a lot of talking.
Yeah.
It's very obvious.
I guess it's just like, is it ethical to agree that they're fat?
It's ethical to feed them.
Right. Straightforward. First question goes, yeah. What common sense question? What common sense treatment approach would you recommend? Is that what you're saying? Feed them? Is that I think the word important evidence says enable support. Some patients
I guess that
kind of an obligation.
I mean, I think where this is getting
Essentially, a misconception is
It's a sad picture.
Okay.
So we look at. She's hard to look at.
Attention. Thumbs up. So, that row front, what did you think for the first question?
He didn't believe it was ethical because by supporting the incongruence, you're kind of harming the person in a sense by allowing them to. I guess it plays more into the next question too, but like if you support the incongruence between their mental and physical state where they think they're fat when really they're like dying because they don't have any body mass, then you're just kind of leaving and killing them.
Yep.
In a sense.
First row at the rear, second row at the rear, what was your summary?
I mean, we said it's unethical basically because it's a lie. You're lying them to continue their religion, and that's not the best way to go.
Yeah.
It's the best way to go.
Very good. Over here, you were supposed to do the second question, I believe. What was your answer? No? Why?
They're affirming a lie.
You're affirming a lie. Okay. Was it? Do you guys at the back? Did you have a separate answer?
No, it's
okay.
Still no. Yes.
Okay. Over here, third question. What did you guys come up with?
Same answer. No.
Okay, you guys are all consistent. Okay. Now, there's a technique you use when trying to look at these problems. You take it to their extreme, right? This is what I call sheepia. I am convinced that I am really a sheep and not a man. I only eat plants. I ask that you call me by my sheep name, Bad Bad Black Sheep. I have hair plugs implanted all over my body to grow hair like a sheep. But I'm going to make the final step. I've decided to have a surgery to have hooves. But my arms are not set up properly, nor are my legs. So I'm going to cut off my arms at the elbow and at my legs at the knees, so I kind of have proportionally like a sheep. I'm going to have bone grafts so that I have hooves. Okay. We're going to have to do this by voice. What is the ethical thing for you to do?
Not that.
What is the ethical thing for you to do, right?
Have you admitted?
Speak up, please.
Have you admitted?
Have me admitted. I would actually say yes. I would hope you would do that for me. Should I do that? Should the government pay for this treatment using tax dollars?
No.
No? What is the common sense treatment that I should pursue? It's a mind thing. Okay. So we're going to dig in here. I am convinced that I'm really a woman and not a man. I ask you that you call me by my field name, Chrissy. I put on makeup and wear women's clothes. I have laser surgery. I have breast implants installed. Then I decide to make the big final move. Boys, I hope you get squeamish. I've decided to have surgery to have my male parts removed and a pseudo-vagina created. The wound is created in my body that is deep like a normal vagina. The penis is skinned, and that skin is used to form a vaginal wall. Skin from other, not to be mentioned, cut-out parts is used to simulate the vaginal structures. Parts of the penis are used to form something like a clitoris. If there isn't enough skin from the cut-off parts, it is removed from other parts of my body. What is the ethical thing for you to do?
Talk you out of it?
Pardon me?
Maybe try to talk you out of it?
Definitely not supported in that way, right? Yes. Should the government pay for this treatment in tax dollars? What is the common sense treatment you recommend I pursue? Pardon?
Church membership.
We'll talk about that in a minute, right? So if I would recommend that you see a professional psychologist, psychiatrist who specializes in this. And I'm not meaning, my purpose here is not in demeaning the problem, right? My purpose is in highlighting that we don't want to be hypocrites. Yes?
There was a time in history where we would have had the same response as on the previous slide. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, at what point was there like this huge transition to where instead of saying, look, this is addressing it for the problem that it is, and like, as far as it goes mentally, when and kind of why did we just like stop saying, hey, look, you actually have a brain issue, and instead say, you know what, we need to help you achieve this goal that you are truly a woman instead of a man.
So I'm going to ask you guys to stick with me for another 15. I will answer your question in a very simplistic way. What this slide talks about is these surgeries and lifelong medications, right? Because you're taking hormones for life, are now being paid for by the government. They were not paid for by the government prior. So this is a slide I would like to have you listen to.
Starting in January 1st of 2017, according to the Affordable Care Act, insurance carriers are mandated to cover medical expenses for trans folks. Some of our BUMC financial folks in October of 2016, starting a couple of years ago, put down some costs of how much money we think each patient would bring in. And this is only including top surgery. This isn't including any bottom surgery. And it's a lot of money. These surgeries make a lot of money. So female to male chest reconstruction can bring in $40,000. A patient just on routine hormone treatment, who I'm only seeing a few times a year, can bring in several $1,000s. That requires a lot of visits and labs. It actually makes money for the hospital. Now these I got from the internet, but it's from the Philadelphia Center for Transgender Surgery, which does a lot of surgery for patients. And I just want to give you an idea of how much these bottom surgeries are making. And I think this has to be an underestimate. This is for a vaginoplasty. They're quoting roughly around $20,000 for a vaginoplasty, but that doesn't include your hospital stay. That doesn't include your post-op visits. That doesn't include your anesthesia, your OR. So I would think that this has to be a gross underestimate. I think that's just like the surgeon's piece of it, which anybody who's ever been in the hospital knows that that's like 10% of it. And then the female to male bottom surgeries, these are huge money makers. Again, I think this has to be an underestimate that they're quoting around $20,000 for a phalloplasty. There's been different things that I've read that said it could be up to $100,000. Dr. Winokur, who's our surgeon, says that there's entire clinics where the entire clinic is supported just by their phalloplasties, and that is like a fraction of the surgeries that they're doing. These surgeries are labor intensive, they require a lot of follow-ups, they require a lot of OR time, and they make money. They make money fast.
This is a doctor from Vanderbilt University Vanderbilt opened his trans clinic in 2018. Dr. Shane Taylor explained how she convinced Nashville Hospital to get into the gender transition game. She emphasized that it was for the good health of the people, that would help them live long lives and more fulfilling lives. Is that what it says? No. No, it says she emphasized that it's a big money maker, especially because the surgeries require a lot of follow-up. And for big pharma, it requires a patient for life to forever take hormone treatments, and is paid for by the government now. the answer to your question is you have sociopaths running companies who don't care about the health of people, they just want to make lots and lots of money. And in 2010 and beyond, they started providing money to organizations to promote this. There has been a somewhat, there's been a campaign by various organizations funded by people who want to make lots of money to promote this. That's why. What about the parents? You see these shows, the parents, oh yes, you know, where do we leave off? Please.
Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or Munchausen by proxy, is a psychological disorder marked by attention-seeking behavior by a caregiver through those who are in their care. MSP is a relatively rare behavioral disorder. It affects a primary caretaker, often the mother. The person with MSP gains attention by seeking medical help for exaggerated or made-up symptoms of a child in their care. As healthcare providers strive to identify what's causing the child's symptoms, the deliberate actions of the parent or caretaker can often make the symptoms worse.
In children, I see stories about mothers who claim their 3-year-old is transgender. That woman, I believe, has this. Right? That is not a normal conclusion to come to. So I'm not saying all mothers have this. I'm saying that if there is a mother who brings a young child and says this child is transgender, that mother should be assessed for this syndrome. So what are the alternatives? When there's a mismatch between body and mind, should you try to influence the mind to fit the body? Or do you try to reshape the body to fit the mind? Should be allowed to investigate the reasons behind the mismatch. And in the past, professional counselors sought to influence the mind to fit the body. Seems like that's a reasonable thing to go. But there's not much money in it, folks. There's not much money in it. Okay. I'm going to go through this quickly, a Christian analysis and response. There's 2 videos. Well, I'm going to skip this. Actually, I can't. So we talked about the lower story and the upper story in the secular culture. In the Christian culture, in the Christian worldview, there is no separation. God made you a mind and a body that are one thing. There's a unity. You are not separate. You're not disjointed. You're integrated. And the body and the mind inform each other. So this is something I would suggest you take away and think about. Your mind is not higher than your body is not lower than your mind. You are the same thing from the Christian point of view.
I have a question.
Yes?
On the previous side, what do you mean by morally good? Well,
Where did I say morally good?
When you're
the
just
mind
on.
and body.
This one?
Yeah. Integrated.
Oh, morally good. In Genesis, when it said God said it's good, right? For 7 days.
So like the way it was created, not
The Hebrew word there, good, is morally good. It is morally perfect. So God didn't create the order in terms of physically good, but from God's point of view, it was morally good. It was created good. That's where it comes from.
it's like the thing itself, regardless
The thing
of
itself.
nature and all that.
Yeah. Let me introduce Morley London. That is him on your left. That is him now on your right. I never would have made the recognition.
What would you say to a child if you had a one-on-one with a child who was struggling with gender dysphoria? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would just say, just remain strong. Find love within your heart. You know, also going to church is very helpful when you hear the teachings of Jesus from the Bible. It's just very positive. And you know, some kids, they feel lost, they feel confused. So I would just say to the kids, you know, you will get through this. Stay strong. This is just a phase. You know, you one day are going to be a great, successful person. You're going to have a great career. you're going to have a great education. So just please hang in there, be strong, and just know that there's people out there that will support you. You know, family, friends, there are psychiatrists, there are people out there to help. So, you know, if any kid is watching this and feeling confused or lost, just know that there's people out there that can help.
Great. And are there members of the trans community that have reached out to you since you made the decision to detransition?
Yeah, so on one side, I've had a lot of people that have detransitioned that have actually messaged me and showed their support and, you know, thanked me for speaking out. I've had so many parents across America, you know, saying thank you. They've also shared their stories of their kids, you know, struggling with gender dysphoria. So I've had a lot of messages, but in terms of the hardcore trans lobby, the very, very kind of far liberal trans groups, you know, they have been really, really harassing me like nonstop on Twitter. I've had so many direct messages, death threats, harassment, you know, and it's just why would anyone want to do that hate, you know? You know, God and Jesus are all about love, spreading positivity, helping one another, kindness. So I feel like these people, you know, they're not happy with themselves, so they're trying to project their hate on someone else. But yeah, they've sent me so much hate. And, you know, I almost feel like the trans lobby has almost become like a cult. So they are pushing these ideas on children. They are, you know, pushing this into the education system. And, you know, someone like me, I left the trans community and suddenly they attack me. They try to dehumanize me. You know, they call me names online. They compare me to some very horrible people. You know, I saw one tweet was comparing me to Hitler, like really, really horrible things. But, you know, I just ignore that. You know, I don't pay attention to the hate. I'm all about love. I'm all about positivity, finding God and finding happiness within.
That's awesome. Ali, I just want to thank you for joining me today and thank you for sharing your wonderful story. It's amazing, you know, just the power of God and Him changing your life and how you're really on a mission to, you know, save children. So that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate that and have an amazing day.
You too.
Thank you.
Did you expect that? No. This is Walt Heyer. That's him on the left as a young man. That's him in the middle as living as a woman. That's him now. This is a little long. Stay with it. It's worth it.
Born and raised in Los Angeles, California. You know, my upbringing was pretty much a typical California upbringing in Los Angeles in the early 40s. It wasn't really anything remarkable. At least not until my dad began to take me over and drop me off at my grandma's house. Grandma was a seamstress and made dresses. And I became very curious about her work, and my curiosity led to her making me a purple chiffon dress that she made just to fit my perfect little 4-year-old body. You know, at first it felt really exciting to have somebody telling me how wonderful and cute I was. But what I didn't realize was happening is the second Grandma began to tell me how cute I looked in that purple dress, what she was really saying was that there was something radically wrong with the little boy that I really was. And so that begins this sort of creepy kind of psychological and emotional destruction that starts with inside a young boy, 4 years old, who doesn't know what the consequences are going to be about putting on a dress at 4 years old. And keeping it a secret from my parents for nearly 2 years, until I became so accustomed to wearing that purple dress that I decided to take the dress home so that I could put it on when my parents weren't watching or when I was alone, and I could sort of listen and hear those affirmations. I became sort of addicted to the affirmations and hearing her say how cute I was. So I had the purple dress at home, but my mom found it in my bottom dresser drawer. And she said, "Well, where did you get this dress?" And I said, "Well, Grandma made it." And that just blew the house up. My dad was upset. My mom was upset. It was supposed to be a secret. I broke the secret. And as a result of that, I could not go back to Grandma's house without my mom or dad being with me. Dad didn't know what to do. His mother-in-law had just been cross-dressing his young boy. He was so angry at my grandmother that he took his anger out in his discipline on me, and he started hitting me with a hardwood floor plank when I would do something wrong. Sometimes he was just being way too critical, but it was that what was built up in him because of what happened to me. He did not know what to do. If you can imagine in 1946, 47, there's no information about kids wearing dresses. But the next part of the equation was his adopted brother, Uncle Fred, heard about me wearing the purple dress, and Uncle Fred decided that I was fair game to be sexually abused. Uncle Fred was not playing with a full deck of cards, and he'd get drinking a little bit, and he would come looking for me, and he would molest me. The emotional and psychological issues that I had from Grandma affirming me, I didn't really realize the consequences of those for many years. The hardwood floor plank obviously was very devastating, and then the sexual abuse was sort of the cherry on top of the cake. I was a broken child before I was 10 years old. You know, I decided that maybe I should have been a girl, not realizing that what I was trying to do was escape the abuse, not actually change who I was. But it resulted in me going through this process for many years of cross-dressing, going out in public as a female. And so I went through this with, even in my first marriage. I had 2 children. I was an executive for American Honda Motor Company. I worked on the Apollo space missions as an associate design engineer. But that purple dress, the hardwood floor plank, and the sexual abuse was about to take everything away. Then the next critical step was struggling with my identity. I went to a gender specialist in San Francisco who promptly identified me with gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder and promptly told me that I needed hormones and surgery. That was the treatment that he was prescribing to help me end the cycle of distress I was having about my gender because of what happened to me as a young child. The doctor I went to, his name is Dr. Paul Walker. Dr. Paul Walker was a homosexual transgender activist. He felt his job was to do like they're doing today, is to introduce people to hormones and surgery as a process of treatment. Now keep in mind, Dr. Paul Walker was not just your average therapist. Dr. Paul Walker was the author, the primary chairperson and author of the Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care, the very same standards of care that's being used today that's called WPATH Standards of Care. His agenda was pushing transgenderism, pushing surgery, and pushing hormones recklessly and really damaging someone's life like mine. I had kind of a devastating run of events. When I was struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction, I went into a treatment facility as Laura Jensen and came out the other side, and I went through a 2.5 or 3 hour therapy session with my psychologist. And during that day, I went through all of the things that had happened, the sexual abuse.
Summary. Christians should reject the upper and lower story dualism. It has many contradictions and inconsistencies. Christians should not entertain queer and gender theory because of this. Gender-affirming care harms children, and it must be opposed. The strong must protect the weak. People suffering from gender dysphoria need love and the gospel. What we just heard is that the gospel fills a need that helps to heal gender dysphoria. This is a spiritual problem as well as a mental health issue. So share the gospel wherever you go. It is the key to mental health in this case. I'll leave you with what I consider a warning. Having been researching this for about a year, there's now so much money involved in this. It has corrupted everything. Future academic research cannot be trusted by default. You must assume it is a lie. You must read it and judge for yourself whether it has some truth in it. Why? Grant funding, tenure, peer networks, social networks are all skewed to being pro-transgender activism. It's really an echo chamber where dissenting research is not permitted. Tavistock Clinic held back a study for multiple years because it didn't promote what they wanted. Do not trust doctors and medical associations by default. Medical licenses, access to medical institutions, peer networks, social networks, are all skewed to being pro-transgender activists. There are huge financial benefits for big pharma, hospitals, and doctors. Money corrupts. Do not trust the transgender activists, mainly because they aren't seeking the truth, they're seeking power. And that's it. Okay. You've been a great group. It's long past. Thank you for waiting. Questions, thoughts, comments?